Here lie the mortal remains of Colonel Benjamin Franklin McCollum, leader of the infamous McCollum gang. He hailed from a long line of rebels and rogues. Ben's grandfather served in the War of 1812, and his great-grandfather served in the Revolution. The McCollum family seems to have always taken sides in war, and this was no different when the Civil War came along. Ever the rebellious spirit, Benjamin promptly joined the Southland. He would fight as a regular for a year, but was frequently sick, including with a dreaded condition called camp fever. His first enlistment expired while he was hospitalized in Virginia. However, seeking to get back to the fight, he rode his own horse all the way from North Georgia to Richmond, Virginia, braving bushwhackers and partisans. This was in August 1862. He probably had a come-to-Jesus moment upon his return to Georgia. Muster rolls from late October list him as AWOL. He had learned that his older brothers, John and George, had been killed, and his younger brother gravely wounded. His uncle and cousin had both died of disease in Tennessee. Things seemed hopeless. Even though he was AWOL, inconclusive records show that he had a semi-official status as a leader of a Home Guard gang around September 1864. He was actually commissioned by Governor Joseph E. Brown as a captain to sweep through North Georgia, terminating Unionists with extreme prejudice. The South had entered a period late in the war in which war crimes were commonplace, and Confederate leaders and politicians looked the opposite direction. They almost certainly knew that Ben McCollum had a bone to pick with Union men. 1 month later, he was authorized to raise a force of reserves and non-conscripts, basically a civilian cavalry. This was known as the McCollum Gang, and they were ruthless. He was a colonel now, and when an inspector recommended that his unit be mustered out as soon as possible for fighting as a gang, the governor promptly ignored the request. The McCollum Gang usually operated in Cherokee and Pickens counties and was often said by those in North Georgia to be led by a renegade. When they couldn't find some of Sherman's boys who had wandered too far off the federal road, they'd prey on civilians, often accusing them of supporting the Union before they hanged them. Sherman was following Southern partisans, and in a letter to Lincoln's military advisor sometime prior to the McCollum Gang's formation, he explained that the South could be divided into 4 separate categories: large planters, small farmers, Unionists, and young bloods. He explained the first 3 could be controlled by an occupation, but of the young bloods who followed men like Forrest, quote, "This class of men must all be killed." After the war and throughout Reconstruction, McCollum carried this reputation as a youngblood. For a while he practiced law, but his Civil War escapades quickly caught up with him in the early 1870s. The May 24, 1873 edition of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reports that he was wanted for a time for the murder of a man during the war. The state legislature had stricken this indictment from the record, but a dozen or so men who felt personally slighted by him formed a posse with the intent to take him dead or alive. In a hail of bullets, he slashed the posse leader's throat and narrowly escaped. Several other family feuds and shootouts followed when finally Ben decided to move for his own protection to Henry County, where he continued practicing law. There he made enemies with the town's deputy, who appears to have been protecting a brothel near his law office. In fact, Ben had brought this up to the town council and requested the brothel be removed. The marshal responded by threatening to kill any man who dared touch his brothel. The cop began carrying around a loaded double-barrel shotgun. On May 26th, a fight broke out between 2 men outside over the brothel, and McCollum barged out into the street to grab the gun from one of them. The marshal appeared and demanded that McCollum hand him the gun, but McCollum stated that he'd solved the issue himself and would be keeping the pistol as a reward for doing the marshal's job for him. McCollum then accused the deputy marshal of being a dirty drunk, to which the cop called him a damned liar. The deputy left to retrieve his shotgun, and when he arrived back, the town had gathered outside and seized the gun from him, demanding he simply return to his home. McCollum, however, was taunting the deputy to the chagrin of his friends, who begged him to go home as well. The deputy got control of his own gun and blew a hole in McCollum's chest. He left behind a wife and 4 children. I'm here at the old Shiloh Methodist Church in Cherokee County to talk some about the McCollum Gang and the brothers who joined this gang. Buried here in front of me is Reverend James McCollum, brother to the leader of the Cherokee Scouts, Colonel Benjamin McCollum. Now, Colonel Benjamin McCollum had been discharged some time before after his enlistment expired, and he'd fallen sick. Once recuperated, he took his own horse all the way up to Virginia to volunteer in Philip's Legion. Towards the end of the war, the McCollum brothers, who'd been fighting in various armies, the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Northern Virginia, began returning to North Georgia as their enlistments expired, finding it a radically changed place. Folks had greater Union sympathies, and many refused to pay taxes. They could see the writing on the walls. Some were even daring enough to cross up into eastern Tennessee and join the Union Army outright. Records around this time become intentionally very vague because they began joining Home Guard units, which were charged with a sort of mop-up type operation. Intimidation and summary executions were common, and this was all on order from the governor of Georgia at the time, a man named Joseph E. Brown. By the time the Cherokee Scouts, led by the Reverend's brother, were truly active, Sherman occupied much of North Georgia and controlled a railroad coming down from Tennessee, ferrying in Union troops. Several hundred men in North Georgia had joined a Union volunteer regiment specifically created for the state of Georgia, and they were widely hated for only hopping on for the last few months of the war, often thought of as having no loyalty to either side. In fact, Sherman refused to arm these men, who were mostly just used to guard the railroads. A myriad of semi-state sanctioned Home Guard units, like the Cherokee Scouts, began to look more like gangs. You had among others the McCollum Gang, or the Cherokee Scouts, the Johnston Gang, Gatewoods men who would lurk the forests, killing Union sympathizers and beating their families. Another task of the Home Guard was requisitioning supplies for Home Guard men, and this way the Johnston Gang, with whom McCollum worked, is said to have killed 140 men, women, and children, often families of Confederate soldiers off fighting who felt that they shouldn't pay taxes because they could already not make ends meet. These men in the McCollum Gang, men in the Johnston Gang, were widely despised by both proud Southerners and Yankee sympathizers. After the war, many of them went to Texas or Indian Territory or simply dropped off the face of the earth. The Reverend here, however, I'm happy to report, lived very well, was comfortable in his latter years, and was probably horrified by what he saw in the war and tried to put it all behind him, and this was all at the hands of his brother Benjamin. He became a Reverend of the Shiloh Methodist Church, married a local girl named Louisa, and had a baby named Jemima. He died here in the county of his birth at age 72. And many of the McCollum brothers are buried in the shadow of the mountains where their gang, working alongside Gatewood and the Johnston Gang, would terrorize Union soldiers who wandered off or people who they felt weren't loyal to the Confederacy on orders from the governor of Georgia at the time. One of the other McCollum brothers to remain in Georgia is Bobby, who likewise lived to the old age of 71 and was buried not far from his brother, the Reverend of the Shiloh Methodist Church. He's buried here in the Little River Methodist Church in the same county of his birth. He started a small family with his wife Elizabeth, and they now have their own plot around him. Relatively little is known about Bobby McCollum's role in the McCollum Gang, or the Cherokee Scouts. Father of the McCollum boys, Jesse McCollum, may explain the brutal nature of the Cherokee Scouts and why his sons would come to be seen as a gang and, in some instances, be forced to go into a self-imposed exile. He came from a long line of patriots, his grandfather Daniel literally serving in the Revolutionary War, and his descendants boomed throughout Georgia. They took their father and grandfather's legacy very seriously. Daniel's grandson, Jesse, buried here, the father of the McCollum Gang's leaders, married a Cherokee woman named Elizabeth and was distraught at the politics of the day. He saw Cherokee removal as a young man and what happened to his lover's people at the hands of Uncle Sam once the government decided they were politically inconvenient. He also believed, as did most Southerners of the day, that states had a right to make their own decisions on any matter, regardless of what the federal government said. Feeling that Uncle Sam now viewed Southerners the same way they viewed his wife's family, all his sons enlisted at their first possible chance. By the time they made it back, their Cherokee mother Elizabeth had died, and Georgia had changed dramatically. They saw that their work was cut out for them, but that they could enact some vengeance against the federal government that they believe had wronged their parents. This is why I think the Cherokee Scouts earned that moniker, the McCollum Gang. And if you want to see the grave of the father of the leaders of the McCollum Gang, it's here in the shadow of the church, and I wanted to show its location because it's very nondescript. In Canton, Georgia, buried in the same cemetery as the father of the leader of the Cherokee Scouts, is Bob Cowart. Mr. Cowart was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive military fraternal order deeply embedded into the Confederacy. Their central belief was in the formation of a slave empire south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they were standing on the shoulders of men like William Walker, who had invaded Nicaragua and Mexico to achieve these goals some years before the Civil War began. It's unknown what contact Cowart had with the Cherokee Scouts, but he certainly knew of them and helped to recruit to their ranks. He held the unusual position of Indian agent of the Knights of the Golden Circle, pretty loosely affiliated with the Confederacy as far as I can tell. Understand here that Missouri and Arkansas were both contentious states, plagued with bushwhackers, terrorists, gangs, and spies, both Union and Confederate. To their west was the 5 million acre Indian Territory. Robert Cowart, who hailed from Georgia, and Douglas Cooper from Mississippi, traveled west to recruit mixed-race men to join the Confederacy, often acting as partisans. These Native Americans fought tooth and nail in the conflict because their war was with the same Uncle Sam that forced them to Oklahoma, and their economy depended as well on slavery, albeit to a lesser extent. To the Knights, this was fantastic. Members of the KGC were well known to enlist in exotic militaries as soldiers of fortune, and their leadership spoke of Ottoman Janissaries, the Mongol Empire, and their desire to serve the dictators of South America. The Cherokee would have seemed a perfect choice for these mystery-loving soldiers of fortune. However, conflict was brewing in Indian Territory. While mixed-blood Cherokees generally favored the Knights of the Golden Circle, full-blood Indians disapproved. Mixed-race folks controlled most of the reservation's politics and owned thousands of slaves, while full-bloods had very little. In response to Cowart and the KGC's presence, full-blooded Cherokee formed their own Keetoowah Society to continue their traditional ways. This was actually a direct counter to the KGC and appealed to young men's desire for adventure and to join a secret society. Not wanting to create a conflict, the Confederacy established an official Bureau of Indian Affairs in March of 1861. A month later, Cowart, who seems to have still been in the area, teamed up with another Georgia Knights of the Golden Circle activist, Alexander Gaulding, who offered Westerners free tickets east if they wanted to volunteer. In fact, it seems like business leaders and KGC members in Georgia were crucial to enlisting a huge number of early Confederate volunteers. Many of the mixed blood recruited by Cowart would go on to join the Cherokee Scouts. And you can see from Cowart's grave that he was born in Burke County, Georgia in the early 1800s, and that he was an upright judge. Now, that characterizes many men who were high-ranking members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. They were judges, and in fact, after the Civil War, many of them went on to join state politics or continue their legal practices, which sort of accounts for the formation of the Jim Crow-era South. These KGC men were back in charge. And make note of the fact that buried just behind Mr. Cowart is a member of the Cherokee Legion, right over here past the water fountain.